Hello guys, welcome to my channel where stories filled with revenge, moral lessons and love are told. Go ahead and like, share with your friends and subscribe. I was 8 years old when my world shifted forever. My father, Jonathan, had been the steady anchor of my childhood, gentle, warm, and always making time to tell me bedtime stories even after long hours at work. When he suddenly passed away from a heart attack, I felt as though someone had ripped the foundation out from beneath me. The funeral blurred into a haze of black clothes, murmured condolences, and the smell of fresh lilies that now I cannot stand. My mother, Helena, wept silently beside me, clutching my hand as if I were the last rope holding her upright. I didn't understand then, but grief would change her as much as it did me. Life after his death was quiet at first, like we were both floating in some hollow silence. But then came Victor. He entered our lives slowly, first as a kind neighbor who offered to fix the broken railing on our porch, then as the man who began leaving small notes for Helena on her car windshield. At first I saw a smile return to her face, and I remember thinking maybe that was a good thing. She needed someone to talk to, someone to make her laugh again. And Victor, with his charming manners and constant presence, filled that void. The change started small, so small that it slipped past me like shadows in a hallway. Victor moved in after only a few months of dating, bringing with him not just his belongings but an air of authority that seemed to suffocate the very air in the house. He would compliment Helena on her cooking but then criticize the way she dressed. "You'd look better in softer colors," he would say, brushing his hand against her blouse with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. I watched unsure, but I didn't speak. Children see more than adults believe, and though I didn't have the words for it then, I knew something was wrong. Soon he took control of the small details that had once been ours. The finances shifted into his hands. He began keeping track of who Helena spoke to and discouraged her from visiting her longtime friend, Maria, who lived only a few streets away. "She's a bad influence," he said one evening, his voice calm but firm, as though stating a fact. Helena tried to protest, but he silenced her with a look that made my stomach twist. I began noticing how she stopped answering phone calls when he was around, and how she avoided eye contact when people asked her about him. One night, I woke up to the sound of raised voices. Peeking through the crack of my bedroom door, I saw Victor standing over Helena, his face twisted with anger. She was holding a plate, her hands trembling, and then the plate shattered on the floor as he slapped it from her grip. "You never listen," he barked, his voice so sharp it made me jump. My mother bent down to clean the pieces, whispering apologies like a broken record. That was the first night I realized my house was no longer safe. I learned to make myself small. I buried myself in schoolwork, reading late into the night, escaping into books where villains were punished, and heroines always found a way to survive. I spent more time at the library than at home, claiming I needed extra study hours. The librarians knew me by name and kept me company with their quiet kindness. At home, silence was safer. I learned how to walk without making noise, how to breathe shallowly when Victor was in one of his moods, and how to hide the fear that sat heavy in my chest. But the day that truly cemented my understanding came when I was 14. I walked into the living room to find Victor gripping Helena's arm so tightly her skin had turned red. She tried to twist away, tears brimming in her eyes, but he shook her hard enough to make her stumble. "You're nothing without me," he growled, his face inches from hers. For the first time, Helena caught my gaze across the room. Her lips trembled as though she wanted to tell me to run, to look away, but she said nothing. I stood frozen, unable to move, and in that frozen silence something inside me broke too. After that, I threw myself even harder into my studies. My teachers praised my work, saying I had potential. I clung to their words like lifelines. Each good grade was another rung on the ladder I was desperately building to climb out of that house. I told myself that if I could just make it to college, I could start over. I could breathe. I could escape Victor's shadow. Helena, though, stayed. Every time I begged her to leave, she brushed my hair back and whispered, "It's complicated, Alara. I can't just walk away." That was the name she gave me when I was born, a name my father had chosen for me. Hearing it from her lips was like a reminder of a safer time, but the excuses made me furious. "You can," I whispered once, my voice cracking. "You can choose us over him." She only shook her head, her eyes distant, as if she was looking at something beyond me. By the time I turned 17, I had one foot out the door. College letters arrived, and the best one came from Boston University. When I showed Helena, she smiled with watery eyes and hugged me so tightly I could hardly breathe. Victor, on the other hand, only nodded. Boston's far, he said, his tone neutral but layered with something dark. Don't forget where you came from. His words lodged themselves in my throat like thorns. I promised myself I would not forget, but not for the reasons he meant. Leaving for Boston was both liberation and guilt tangled together. I worried constantly about Helena. Would he hurt her worse without me there? Would she ever find the courage to leave him? But as the train pulled out of the station, I felt a sliver of hope I hadn't felt in years. I was heading toward a future where Victor couldn't dictate my every move, where maybe, just maybe, I could build a life worth living. In Boston, the world felt bigger and brighter. I met people who spoke with laughter that wasn't weighed down by fear, who invited me into study groups and late-night coffee runs. One professor, Dr. Levine, noticed the way I threw myself into my psychology courses with unusual intensity. "You're not just learning this," she said once, peering at me kindly. "You're living it." Her words stunned me, but they planted a seed. Maybe one day, I could use my pain to help others. Still, no matter how far I was from home, the shadow of Victor clung to me. Every phone call from Helena carried a note of caution. She never said much about him, only that things were fine. But I could hear it in her voice, the tremor that told me the chain still held her tight. And so I carried both relief and dread inside me, bracing for the day when those worlds would collide again. Boston gave me air, but it also gave me distance, and that distance sharpened everything I had lived through. Each time I came back home during holidays, I noticed new cracks in Helena's smile. She tried to cover them with makeup and chatter, but I saw through her disguise. Victor, on the other hand, had grown colder. His charm had faded into a sharp-edged disdain that filled every room. I had learned by then how to keep my voice calm and neutral around him, to avoid sparking the fire I knew lived under his skin. But I also knew my time under his roof was temporary. I was building a life that would never again revolve around his moods. By the time I began graduate school, my world looked nothing like the one he had tried to trap me in. I had friends who knew me not as a fearful child, but as an ambitious young woman. I had professors who respected my ideas, and I had found solace in therapy, slowly untangling the knots Victor had left in my mind. Still, the tether to Helena remained uncut. She called me often, sometimes in whispers, sometimes with a forced brightness that made my chest ache. I could sense the silent battles she fought every day. One evening, just after my 23rd birthday, I received a call from her that shook me to my core. Her voice was trembling, barely audible. "Alara," she whispered. "I'm leaving him. I can't do this anymore." My heart pounded with a mix of joy and terror. I had begged for this moment for years, but I also knew Victor would not let her go easily. "I'll help you," I said quickly. "We can find a safe place, call the authorities," but she cut me off. "No, don't come yet. I need to plan. Just be ready." The waiting was unbearable. Each day I imagined Victor discovering her intentions, imagining the storm that would follow. And then one night the storm arrived. It was past midnight when I heard the crash against my apartment door. I shot up from bed, heart hammering, and before I could react, the door burst open. Victor stood in the frame, his face contorted with fury, his eyes bloodshot. For a split second I couldn't breathe. How had he found me? Why was he here? Behind him, in the shadows of the hallway, I saw Helena. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, but she didn't move. My body froze as Victor stormed inside, his heavy footsteps echoing like thunder. "You think you can turn her against me?" he roared, his voice shaking the walls. I tried to back away, but he was faster. His hand slammed against my shoulder, and a sharp tearing pain ripped through me. The world blurred as my shoulder dislocated, the agony so fierce I nearly blacked out. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my vision spinning. Victor loomed over me, his fists clenched, his breath ragged with rage. "You'll never break us apart," he spat. Helena stood frozen in the doorway, tears streaking her cheeks, her hands trembling. For a moment, I thought she would turn away, like she had so many times before. But then something shifted. Her voice, thin but determined, cut through the chaos. Enough, Victor. The room went still. He turned toward her, his face twisting in disbelief. What did you say? He growled. Helena stepped forward, her body trembling but her voice steadier this time. Enough. You won't touch her again. You won't touch me again. Her eyes met mine, and I saw in them a fire I had never seen before. For the first time, she wasn't shrinking back, she was standing tall. Victor lunged toward her, but Helena's scream pierced the air, followed by the sound of neighbors pounding on the walls and voices shouting in the hallway. Someone must have called the police because moments later, sirens wailed in the distance. Victor's grip tightened on my arm, but as the door burst open with uniformed officers rushing in, his rein shattered. They pulled him back as he thrashed and cursed, his voice echoing with threats that suddenly rang hollow. I was rushed to the hospital, my shoulders strapped into place, my body bruised and aching. But the deeper wound was watching Helena sit beside my bed, her face etched with guilt. I'm so sorry, she whispered over and over, her tears falling onto my blanket. For once, I didn't tell her it wasn't her fault. For once, I let her carry the weight of her silence because it had nearly cost us both our lives. The days that followed were a blur of police reports, court hearings, and endless recountings of the violence we had endured. Helena testified against him, her voice shaking but her words unflinching. He controlled me, he hurt my daughter, she told the judge. Watching her finally speak, the truth was both devastating and healing. It was as though she was reclaiming every word Victor had ever stolen from her. When the sentence was finally read, 15 years in prison, Victor's face twisted with rage. But his power was gone. The clanging of the handcuffs as they led him away was the sound of chains breaking, not just for Helena, but for me too. We walked out of that courthouse into the sunlight, broken but free. For the first time in years, Helena and I sat together without fear. We shared stories we had never dared to tell, memories of Jonathan, dreams of futures that Victor had tried to bury. She admitted how often she had wanted to leave, but had convinced herself staying was the only way to protect me. I thought if I kept him calm you'd be safe, she whispered. I held her hand, feeling both the anger of lost years and the fragile hope of a new beginning. Even in freedom, healing wasn't instant. I battled nightmares, waking drenched in sweat, hearing echoes of Victor's voice. I struggled with trust, with the shadow of his control lingering in the back of my mind. But each day I saw Helena grow stronger. She found a job, reconnected with old friends, and began painting again, her canvases bursting with colors that told stories of survival. Watching her rebuild gave me strength to keep moving too. Though I carried scars, physical and emotional, I also carried the certainty that Victor no longer defined me. His violence had left me broken on my apartment floor, but it had also awakened the fire in Helena that finally set us free. That night at midnight, when he broke in and tried to shatter me for good, became the night his grip ended forever. The trial left me drained, like I had run a marathon barefoot across broken glass, but it also gave me something Victor had stolen for years: validation. The world finally saw him for who he was, not the polished charmer he pretended to be, and the law held him accountable. When the judge pronounced his 15-year sentence, I felt a rush of relief so strong I nearly collapsed in the courtroom. But freedom isn't the same as healing. Healing was a road I had to walk step by step, and every step felt heavier than the last. I returned to Boston with my arm still in a sling, bruises fading but still tender reminders of that midnight attack. At first, I avoided mirrors because when I looked into them, I saw not myself but the girl crumpled on the floor as Victor towered above me. I forced myself back into therapy, sitting in that same office where I had spent years untangling my childhood. This time, I didn't just talk about survival, I talked about what it meant to live beyond survival. My therapist told me something that stuck. Your scars aren't evidence of weakness, Alara. They are proof of endurance. Slowly, I began to believe her. Helena and I rebuilt our relationship brick by brick. She moved into a small apartment across town, her first place of her own in decades. The walls were bare at first, but soon she filled them with paintings of wild, vibrant explosions of color. She would call me and say, "I don't know what I'm painting, but it feels like freedom." I visited often, sitting on her couch while she worked, the the smell of paint mixing with the sound of music playing softly in the background. We spoke honestly in a way we never had before. She admitted the years she had spent convincing herself she was protecting me, and I admitted the resentment I had carried for her silence. Our conversations didn't erase the past, but they began to stitch something new between us. At graduate school, I poured my energy into my studies with a newfound purpose. No longer was psychology just an escape, it became a mission. I wanted to understand the patterns that trapped people like Helena and me in cycles of control, and more importantly, I wanted to help others break free. I worked under Dr. Levine's guidance, diving deep into trauma studies, and when she suggested I create a community project, I felt a spark ignite. That spark became the Breakthrough Center. It started in a small rented room above a bookstore. I placed flyers in coffee shops, libraries, and community boards. Support group for survivors of domestic abuse. Safe space. Confidential. You are not alone. I didn't know if anyone would come, but on the first night, 7 women walked through the door. They sat in a circle of mismatched chairs, their faces cautious, their voices hesitant. But as the evening unfolded, their stories poured out like rivers long dammed. I realized then that what Victor tried to crush in me had transformed into a strength that could give others hope. The Breakthrough Center grew. Word spread, donations trickled in, and soon we had enough funds to move into a proper space with warm lighting, soft rugs, and walls covered in messages of encouragement. Survivors came not only for support but to rebuild their lives, and I stood there every week, guiding, listening, reminding them they were not broken beyond repair. Every story I heard reminded me that pain doesn't define us, resilience does. It was during one of these group sessions that Eric returned into my life. He had been a friend from my early college years, the kind of person whose laughter filled a room. We had lost touch after graduation, but he appeared one evening with a box of donated supplies, smiling that same easy smile I remembered. "I heard what you're doing here," he said, "and I thought you could use some extra chairs." Our conversations picked up as if no time had passed, but now there was a deeper layer, a recognition of the battles we had both fought in different ways. Slowly, carefully, he became part of my world again, not as a distraction but as a steady, patient presence. For the first time, love didn't feel like chains. It felt like a possibility. Eric never pushed when I hesitated, never flinched when I told him the darker parts of my past. He simply listened, held my hand, and reminded me that trust could be gentle. When he eventually proposed standing in the Breakthrough Center surrounded by candles lit by the very women whose lives had touched mine, I said yes with tears streaming down my face. It wasn't just a promise of a future. It was proof that my past didn't own me anymore. Helena blossomed in her own way. She traveled with Maria, the friend Victor had forbidden her from seeing, and for the first time in years I heard her laugh freely. She even held her own art show in a small gallery, her paintings telling stories of confinement and liberation. People stood before her work with tears in their eyes, moved by the raw truth she had poured onto canvas. Watching her step into her own light was one of the greatest gifts I could have received. And Victor? He sat behind bars, his voice reduced to whispers in prison corridors, his threats meaningless against steel walls. Occasionally, I received updates from the authorities, but I no longer flinched at his name. He had taken so much from us, but he no longer had the power to define us. His chapter in my life had ended, and I refused to reopen it. Looking back, I realized that the midnight attack that nearly destroyed me also became the moment that freed me. It forced Helena to see what she had denied, forced me to confront the shadows I had carried, and forced Victor to face consequences he thought he'd never meet. It was the breaking point, yes, but it was also the beginning of everything I've built since. Today, when I stand before a room full of survivors, I tell them my story not with shame but with strength. I show them my scarred shoulder and tell them it is proof of endurance, not defeat. I remind them that silence protects no one, that love is never supposed to hurt, and that healing is possible even if it takes years. If you are listening to me now, and if my story sounds anything like your life, I want you to know this. You are not alone. You don't have to wait for midnight to break you before you decide to rise. You can choose yourself now. You can choose freedom, love, and life. And when you do, you'll discover strength you never knew you had. Moral lesson. Life has taught me that silence is the heaviest chain a person can wear. For years, I believed that enduring pain was a form of strength, but I've learned true strength lies in breaking Minders that survival is only the first step. Healing comes when we give ourselves permission to speak, to seek help, and to dream of a life beyond fear. Helena and I are living proof that even after decades of control, laughter can return, creativity can bloom, and love can be rediscovered. Victor thought he had the power to define our futures, but his power ended the moment we stood up and chose ourselves. And that is the message I want to leave with you. If you are watching this, I ask you to share this story with someone who might need it. Leave a comment about what lesson spoke to your heart. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss stories like these. And above all, never forget you are stronger than you think, braver than you believe, and you deserve a life filled with peace, love, and freedom.